And then at lunchtime on those Saturdays, when my sister and I were at the newspaper office with him, we would be taken to lunch in downtown Spokane. At the coffee shop in the Davenport Hotel, fanciest hotel in Spokane, where a burger and a milkshake were 15 cents each. So that was our big Saturday out as kids. and to keep us amused, my dad would bring home big stacks of, I guess you'd call them proof sheets for the funnies in the newspaper, the comics. On the back they were blank, so we could read the funny paper strip and then turn them over and use the back to draw pictures on. I think those have all gone into the garbage by now. I don't think there are any that remain, but it was a lot of fun. And then when I was about 13, after my dad passed away, the newspaper called and asked Mother, would I like to be a letter carrier? It was a pretty good paying job for a kid. You purchased your papers from the newspaper office and delivered them, and you had to go around and collect the money every month from your customers, and once a week you went downtown and turned in your money that you'd collected. And because I was given a newspaper route out toward the northeast corner of Spokane, where there weren't houses everywhere, I was a little bit more distance between one house to the next, my paper route had a higher percentage that went to me than most of them in the city did. Well, I did that for a little over a year. It was in 1943, and I was able to buy a very nice bicycle for the day after a month or so of earning some money on that. I had that bicycle till I graduated from college. And I learned a lot, and the boys at that point in time resented any girls being newspaper delivery people very much. It was a boy's job. But World War II was on, and what was happening was that the younger boys, 13, 14, 15, 16, were moving up into delivering telegrams, of which during the war there were many, about your son in the service and so on and so forth. And the 18 and 19-year-olds who had previously delivered telegrams were all moving up into other jobs or being drafted into the military. So there was and the end of that story is that 50 years later in Spokane, I was at a genealogy workshop, and I somehow was talking about being a newspaper girl. There were only two in the city of Spokane during the 30s and 40s, only two of us. And a woman in the audience raised her hand, and I recognized her, and she said, I was the other one. So how's that for coincidence, huh? So we had a little chat afterwards. So, okay. My favorite part of the paper is still, favorite parts are still the editorial page and the cartoons or the funnies and letters to the editor. And we'll talk about letters to the editor later as a category of newspaper things that you want to know about. The comics, the funnies, I still read them because humor has long been a good way to make political commentary without getting everybody mad at you. And there has been a great deal of it in the last few months. I don't know if anybody else follows that particular thread of things, but there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it. Somewhere in here, if I can find it. I probably can't, but that's okay. This morning's was the first one in about 3 weeks in the cartoons that hasn't been, or where there hasn't been any political commentary in the funnies in the Columbian. So, anyway, be that as it may. We're going to talk about obituaries, but we're going to talk about the and more quite a little bit as well. First, I want to tell you a little bit about, I want to do something else first. Let's see if I can go down to where that is. The picture's going to be way down farther, so I'm just going to pass it around. The other thing I did for the newspaper was that I was a cover girl. For the Thanksgiving issue of the Washington, Idaho, and Oregon Farmer, which my dad was the editor of, in November of 1936 when I was 5 years old. And I can still remember that event. One of the secretaries at the paper had a mother who was a good cook, and she baked about a dozen pumpkin pies. And we all went out to her house. By all, I mean my dad and the woman's daughter and about 10 cameramen and reporters, because they thought they would get a piece of free pumpkin pie, which they all did. So we all went out to her house, and they shot numerous shots of me stealing a bite out of the pie while Grandma wasn't looking. And so then that was also, we ruined about 10 pies. And then she made a big bowl of whipped cream, and everybody sat down and had pie and whipped cream. It was quite a wonderful day. So, anyway, oh, here's let's just, the editorial paper, the page this morning was full of political commentary, as you might imagine. But I'll pass around today's cartoon, which is not political commentary. But I thought it was kind of funny. So, all right. Now, obituaries. The first big newspaper venture that I embarked on in my genealogical research involved obituaries that I did not find. But, and many of you have heard my presentation on the double murder in Arkansas story. But that one led to me, when I learned that my ancestor and another man who was a political and business rival of his in Arkansas had killed each other, or been, well, the other guy killed my great-great-grandfather, and then great-great-grandfather's son killed the other guy 2 years later. So, a double murder story over a period of a couple of years. And when I learned about that incident and could find some information that placed it in time, which was 1836 and 1838 when the two murders occurred, I figured that, okay, this had to have made the newspapers. So that's the first place I should start, because I didn't know anything else except the family story that said that he'd been killed by a man that was more important in the community and was never prosecuted. And my great-great-grandfather, I think it was three greats, had to change his name and leave his home area, which indeed he did. Changed his name and went to California, where I was eventually able to trace him down. But so the two killings have occurred now, and so I'm looking for newspapers. So in those days, this was 30 years ago when I started researching this, I went down to the Spokane Public Library and I looked at something called the Air Directory of Newspapers, which was the classic source for locating what newspapers existed during a particular time period in a particular place. Some of your handouts will have information on whatever happened to that whole idea and what's today's world, which is quite different. But, and I found only one newspaper listed that was being printed in the state of Arkansas in 1836. 1836 was the year Arkansas joined the Union. and the political situation was hot and heavy there. The Whig Party split into two factions who were at war with each other. My great-great-grandfather, who had been in the legislature the session before, was defeated by his business rival, John Lasseter, who was also Whig, but of the no slavery version of Whigs, and my great-great-grandfather was a Southerner, so he was for the slavery version of the Whig Party. So they were business and political rivals, and thus the murders occurred. So the only newspaper was the Arkansas Gazette, published in the other part of the state. Later I found another newspaper, the Arkansas Advocate, that was published in central Arkansas for part of that period of time. So I thought, okay, let me see if I can get that on microfilm. I could not. The newspaper repository for the state of Arkansas was at the University of Arkansas in Bentonville. And they did not loan their reels of microfilm newspapers on interlibrary loan like many other places did. That meant, if I wanted to see that newspaper, I was going to have to go to Arkansas. It was my first big genealogy trip. You'll appreciate that. You want to find out something, you want to find out bad enough, you're going to put up the money and pay the fare and go. So I went to Arkansas. and I went to the university, and I was really lucky because I hit that university during their spring break. And the librarians were not busy because there weren't any students on campus looking for stuff to finish their assignments with. So she kept trotting around and asking me what I wanted to look at and bringing out more stuff and more stuff and more stuff until I had not only the newspaper reports of the event, the double murders, but also magazines that gave background articles about the split in the Whig Party and the whole political background of Arkansas and all the arguments about should it become a state or not, and, you know, the whole shooting match. So I learned a lot on that trip, and I was able to find out where his property had been and go out and take a look at it. And he was, my great-great-grandfather was killed at his home place, just a little ways out of Bentonville, or a little ways out of Van Buren, between Van Buren and Bentonville. I was able to go out there and see the property that he had owned, and he was killed there in 1836 in December, and that's the end of any records of where he was buried or anything. There is a little family cemetery on that property that was developed by a later owner of the property. And we think probably my great-great-grandfather's body could be there, but there are very few headstones. So we don't know. The man that was his rival, who was killed 2 years later, is buried in the city cemetery in Van Buren, Arkansas. And when we eventually made contact with his relatives, they did not know the story. And they have since made a trip to Van Buren, Arkansas to see their ancestors' grave there. But anyway, that's enough of that story. So that was my first big encounter with newspapers, but it did teach me how much you can get from newspapers. And it wasn't just the accounts of the murders, but it was a lot of the background about the political situation, confirmation that my great-great-grandfather had indeed served in the legislature, and that the other guy beat him, and the election results were there with their numbers. There were several articles leading up to why they quarreled with each other, and commentaries that the gentleman's way to have solved the issue between them would have been for them to fight a duel, but that didn't happen. Instead, they got into a fist fight. They both pulled their guns and fired, and that sort of thing. Learned a whole lot of stuff. Beyond, and got a pretty good handle on the other family, and so on. So, okay, let us talk about, so that got me started on newspaper research and understanding how much there was there that could happen. So let's look at some obituaries. See if I can figure out how to make this work. Wait. Let's see. You aren't going to be able to read those, are you? I wonder if you can. Are those as fuzzy as I think they are? Well, yeah. I'm not going to read all of them, but these are ones that I think relate to that Whitson family. Yes. I think I have those in the right order. No, that's not the right one. Okay, we're just going to skip over this one. We're going to skip over to, this is Will Lehman. This is down the road quite a piece on my husband's side of the family in Montana. There were two brothers. Charles and Fred Lehman. Fred Lehman was my husband's great-grandfather. The two brothers came from Germany in about 1850, went west with the movement to find gold. They went to Colorado. They went to first they came from Germany in 1850, spent a few weeks as farmhands learning a little English, went to Georgia, worked on the railroad for a while, went up to Tennessee and helped build the Tennessee State Capitol because they were stonemasons by trade back in Germany. Went west when gold was discovered in Colorado in 1859 and found some, and moved on up into Montana and found some more gold and became well-to-do businessmen up in Helena, Montana. And one of them then moved up to the Judith Basin. The articles that you see are all of the newspaper articles around their son Will, Frederick Lehman's son William, who died at the age of 21, probably from a burst appendix. And the first article in the newspaper just says, and that's the little one up in the corner that's in yellow, Will Lehman of Ross's Fork is quite sick at the hotel in Philbrook, which was another little town that doesn't exist anymore. He was brought in from his ranch Sunday morning last. Okay, so then the next one is talking about his death. And I don't, yeah, okay, there it is. Fred Lehman of this city received the sad news of the sudden death of his son, William, at Philbrook yesterday morning. The body is expected here today, here being Helena. When the young man left the city, he was in good health, and his sudden taking off is a great shock to his parents. He was bright and promising, about 20 years of age, and had a wide circle of friends and acquaintances. Okay, so then the next one is another account in a different paper of his death, same details, and it says, Mr. Lehman started from White Sulphur Springs for his home on Ross's Fork in company with a younger brother. And the first day out, he ate heartily of a box of cherries. Soon after, he experienced great pain in the abdomen, accompanied with nausea and vomiting, that goes on from there. Chances are, by modern day knowledge that we've been able to find, we think he probably died from a burst appendix, but that's not certain. So he died, that's the big news. Okay, then the next little one, which I don't think is on that page, says, the funeral services of the late William F. Lehman will take place from his residence at the corner of Park Avenue and Clark Street at 2 o'clock. That's a huge hint about where he's buried, because I could look at the maps of the city of Helena at that time and see where that house was and figure out exactly where it is in today's city. So the rest of those are more accounts of his funeral and so forth. And the upshot is, we think he's buried in the Benton Avenue Cemetery in Helena, which is the oldest cemetery there. And we think it partly because of that description of where the funeral was held. And then there's another one of the articles here that I don't have to read to you that talks about people following his casket straight north from the house to the cemetery. The only cemetery that fits that bill is the Benton Avenue Cemetery, which is about a mile and a half straight north from where that house sits. That house today is the municipal building for the city of Helena. They built that lot. It's a different building. And so we think that's where he's buried. But we never found an obituary for Will. We know his mother is buried there because there is a big monument that says so. And it sits in a plot that has room for about 6 burials in it. I took my brass witching rods with me to Helena on one trip and witched that plot, and the rods cross right where she's buried, right in front of her tomb, and right next to her tomb. They cross. And my husband and I both tried it half a dozen times, and every time the rods crossed exactly in those 2 places, but nowhere else in that plot. There's no written record of who's buried in that plot. We know that, that Will's father purchased the plot. There's a record that he purchased the plot, probably when his wife died, before the son did. But anyway, so we're pretty sure that that's where Will is buried. And I wrote an article about that several years ago and sent it off to the cemetery people in Helen and asked them whether they thought I'd made the case, and they do. They think so. So, anyway, you don't, you know, obituaries aren't always available, and they're not always straightforward anyway. Okay, let's move on. I got to move on here and see if I can figure this one out. Okay. Let me see. Ah, darn. Well, this is Will's aunt. I'm not going to go through these. They and her husband, that's his, and they got pretty good press up in Lewistown where they live, because they were well-to-do merchants. So there's some things we could talk about those, but we're going to skip. I wanted you to see this next one, 3 obituaries of my father's, from 3 different newspapers. And they all say slightly different things. My dad died in 1943 when I was not quite 12 years old. And he was, the reason there's 3 obituaries from 3 different papers is that he was, as I said, a newspaper man. He was well known around the state of Washington. So on the upper left-hand corner, there are no citations on any of these early clippings, you will notice. In those days, nobody thought to put a citation on what newspaper it came out of, or dates, or anything, so they're not. The one in the upper corner, if I'm remembering correctly, was from the Seattle Times. And I'm guessing that one of the others surely would be from the Spokane paper, and maybe both of them. The other one could have been from Yakima, which was where his first newspaper job was. I don't know, I just thought you may want to look in more than one newspaper to find an obituary of someone, especially if they had any prominence or they had any connections with anything. This one I put in here. This is my father-in-law's obituary, simply to show you how many of you have little cards like this from the funeral home, where they've been, yeah, see, it was really popular way to do it, in case the clipping from the newspaper in at least it puts a date on it, things. So, and they're kind of a nice little keepsake. Let's see here. Who have we got here? This one is, don't know who that is. Okay, we're just going to skip that. I don't know why that's there. Oh, okay. Somehow I don't quite have these in the right order, but that's okay. That's my great-grandfather in Kansas. No, that's his son. We're going to skip over that. He got a lot of space because he was a prominent farmer, and he made some discoveries in Kansas about how to raise hay properly and get lots of crop from it. So he was pretty well recognized. Then.
Lethene?
Yeah.
Does that say the date he died?
Not on there, it doesn't.
So
No.
if he died Thursday, what year, what month, etc.?
I know, I have to do some research to figure that one out, don't I? I don't know if I've got anything on here. Oh, okay, handwritten, written in pencil up at the top, which doesn't show on there. It says August 12, 1912. August 8th, 1912. That is when he died. Most of these clippings, a lot of these were sent to my family by other people, and none of them ever put any citations on anything. None of us did in those days. When I first started doing genealogy in the 1960s, nobody was putting citations on and keeping track of your resources. Because I'd been to library school before I started doing genealogy, I had learned a little bit about citations, and then it was a good idea to put where you found the information. So I at least made lists right from the get-go of at least the major source where I found stuff. But you know, a citation by today's standards, no, nobody started doing that until probably 1970s. It became more common for people doing genealogy to put decent citations with stuff. But so most of the newspaper clippings that I have, if I know a date at all, it'll be from some other information. And often it's only an about date. Maybe the family Bible or some notes from my grandmother or some notes from somebody else in the family will have given me a date or an approximate date when that person died, but you don't always know. And we're still talking about a time when birth certificates or death certificates were few and far between. Unless there was a church record about a funeral or something, most states in the United States, especially in the western and midwestern parts of the country, did not start keeping civil death records until about 1907 or so. So you're not just going to go to the state archives and find a death record for this person or a death certificate, which is frustrating, but what are you going to do? And one more I want to mention that I could not find. Oh, John Jay Sauter. I wanted to this one and this one, who was his father, my great grandfather. John Jay Sauter, the previous one, was the only son of my great grandfather's second marriage, and both his obituary and this one for my great grandfather, who was married to this lady, misspell her name in different ways, but they both badly misspell her maiden name. So if I hadn't found other information about her, I would have had a hard time finding her name just from these obituaries. What's interesting about her, I'll just tell you real quickly. J.E. Sauter, he died in Kansas, but that was after his sojourn in Washington State, up in where the little town of Riderwood is. You know where that is, just north of us a little bit in Cowlitz County. He came sometime in the 1880s there, and he came because he had a nephew who lived there and who later left and went to California. But the second wife, her name was Elizabeth Skiles, and she ran a boarding house in Castle Rock for a while. And there were all kinds of rumors about this lady. She was not a person who should have ever married a guy that wanted to be a farmer, because she wanted a more exciting life than that. So when the Alaskan gold rush came along, she showed up in the town of Castle Rock one day. They lived, Riderwood's about 12 or 15 miles from Castle Rock by horse and wagon, driving the buggy, and left it with some neighbors in Castle Rock. And they later reported that she appeared to be wearing 3 dresses, one over the other, and that was the last time she was ever seen alive. She apparently went to Seattle, probably on a train, got on a ship heading for the Alaskan gold rush, and disappeared into the mists of history. Now the ship that she was on, she wrote her husband one letter about the time she left, and it said that she was going to Alaska with some friends. She had tried to get him to want to go to the Alaskan gold rush, but he didn't want to do it. And that's all it said. So she left and went to Alaska, apparently. However, the ship sank on the way to Alaska and everybody on board was killed, so the stories went in the newspapers, and I don't have a copy of that newspaper article. But one of his daughters from his first marriage hired a private detective to see if he could find her, because the reason he died in Kansas was he was heartbroken and he went back there where his other son lived instead of staying in Washington. So, okay, where was I with that? Oh, she disappears. Her name wasn't, hired a private detective, the older daughter hired a private detective, checked around to see if he could find this woman, and her name was not on the passenger list on the ship that sank. So either she changed her name and went on that ship and died in a shipwreck, or she wasn't on the ship. And if she wasn't on the ship, nobody knows what happened to her. So, no, a mysterious family mystery. But anyway. And I don't know that we'll ever solve that one, probably not. There were also rumors that the nephew that lived in Castle Rock about that same time, he had married a Jackson girl from a well-known family up in Cowlitz County, and had a little mill and some logs, and he dropped out of sight too about the same time that she did. But he later turned up in California, in the gold rush country in California, and his children, once they were grown from his marriage with Miss Jackson, were able to make contact with him in California. And there had been rumors that he had a romantic interest in Mrs. J.E. Stalder and vice versa, but who knows? Since neither one of them ever said anything about it, and there's no evidence of any sort. How many of you have stories like that in your families? There's just no answers to them. But the newspapers, and they are interesting. Okay, that's my obituaries thing. Let's move on to marriages and anniversaries, which are probably one of the other real things that you need to look at. I'm going to hop down to that page. That is my mother-in-law's birth father with his second wife. And there's both a picture at the time of their marriage and a picture at the time of their 50th wedding anniversary. When my mother-in-law was 2 years old, her birth mother died, and he gave her up for adoption to a family who never, as long as they lived, acknowledged that she was adopted. They changed her birthday, they changed her name, never would admit that she was adopted, but this was her birth father. And he had made a verbal promise when he gave her up for adoption that he would not try to look for her until she was grown up. I have his letter that explains all of that he wrote to her. He did find her in Wenatchee. She was in the hospital having just given birth to my husband when he first made contact with her, with his second wife. There were 2 children by the second wife. Everything about this couple says they had 5 children, never says any of them were by his first wife and 2 by the second wife. There were 3 daughters by the first wife, 2 children by the second wife. Nothing ever says that they weren't all by one wife. Never mentions the first wife at all in any of these clippings. But there was one. Okay, let's go on now. So that's just why I put them in there. I met them. They moved to the state of Washington to try to find her, and when they did find her, and she accepted the fact that this was her birth dad, she just said, well, people said, well, isn't that awkward? You have here, because her adoptive parents, and there never was a formal adoption either, were still alive for several years after he found her. And they said, well, isn't that awkward? And she said, no, I just figure I have 2 families. So there you go. This is my mother-in-law's wedding, the adopted daughter. Didn't get a whole lot of space on the society page because she was just an ordinary person. And so it says, a very pretty wedding was solemnized in the presence of the immediate relatives at high noon Sunday at the home of the bride's parents. That's her adoptive parents. Then Lola Ethel King, and it gives his the name of her adoptive parents, marries Mr. John Frederick Parks, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting again is on her wedding certificate, she's Lola Ethel King. She's not Lola Ethel Breedlove at all, even though she's met her birth father by this time. No, she hasn't, not yet. She doesn't know, I guess. She doesn't know yet that she's adopted. So the only time I ever knew it to cause her any difficulty was when she wanted to go to England and try to get a passport. And she had to find a way to get a delayed birth certificate first before she could get a passport. Eventually they found the wife of the minister to whom she was given by her father before she was adopted by the King family. And he didn't feel he could take care of her and he was going back to Missouri. So, okay, let's talk about births. There's only one here on this one, and that's, this is an interesting one in a sense because it's the only piece of paper we have about this person in our family history. Often, well, as you can see, this is part of the vital statistics column in the newspaper. And it says at Emmanuel Hospital in Portland, Parks, Nathan and Masonette Parks, Damaris, Bend, a boy, Juan Antonio Kent Parks, 7 pounds 5 ounces, born July 29th. Of course, it doesn't give the year. And I cannot remember the other because there's no citation on the newspaper. I'd have to look at some other records to find the year. We do have it. But, as I said, this is the only record we have about this baby because he was born with a severe heart defect. And shortly after his birth, Nathan and Damaris parted company. They may never have been married in the first place. We don't know that, one way or the other. And she went back to her family in California, and nothing more was ever heard of the baby. So we don't know if he lived or died. So one of those little family mysteries. Oh, here's my cover girl photograph. This one I just called features and photos because I couldn't think of a better thing, but these are the kinds of things you can find in the newspaper. This next one is my mother-in-law, as a homebound person late in her life, living in Kent, getting books brought to her by someone from the King County Library. And the person who's bringing her the books was a pretty good friend of mine. So they did a nice article in the paper about her. It's just an example of something somebody might write an article about. And you've got some space to fill up maybe or whatever. And it just, she was a great reader and she read very widely. And Kathleen, the librarian in question, this was one of her favorite homebound people that she took book materials to. That was quite popular in the late 60s and early 70s. Somebody would actually take books out and go visit people who were homebound and take books to them and then about once a month. I don't think there's any libraries probably doing that anymore. I'm not sure. Then the next two are, I think they're both on the same page, but they were things about my mother. She was chosen Stevens County Senior Citizen of the Year one year, and she was chosen Selected City Teacher of the Year in Colville another year. And I think the Stevens County Senior Citizen one was in 1974. I did write the date. And the other one was 1961. She was Teacher of the Year. She was very proud of those and always kept those clippings. So I did add dates to them. I don't have a proper citation on them, but I'm sure they both came from the Colville Examiner newspaper. This next thing is simply a feature article about a man here, Dr. Warren Clare, who was married to one of my husband's cousins, and he taught school for many years at the Washington State's minimum security prison in south of Olympia, near Olympia. And he taught college level classes there and was quite popular with the the young men that were his students. So he passed away this past year, been retired for quite a while. But it's just, that's in there partly because my daughter said, oh, they'll get a picture to look at. That'll make things more interesting. Okay. And the next one, again, is the kind of a story you could find. Carved Rock tells Quileute Tribal Story. I've got a citation, Columbian, 12 December 2014. The reason I cut that out of the paper and kept it is because my older daughter taught on the Quileute Reservation for the Quileute tribe for several years, and was very instrumental as a teacher in helping them get their language into a written form and create a dictionary of the Quileute language, and also worked with them very closely as a teacher in their school to help them bring forward some of the stories of their tribal culture. So that one was of interest to my family for that reason. And it just talks about how they found a petroglyph believed to date from around the 1700s on their reservation out on the Arctic Peninsula. All right, let's talk about business ventures. That's another thing that can get you in the paper. This one is H.F. Stalder has purchased the meat market at Addie. That was my grandfather. And it's just a little squib in the Colville newspaper. I have a citation on there, as you can see. Talks about him buying the meat market, which is just the only time he wasn't a farmer in his entire life. He bought that meat market. Well, he was a farmer too, but he ran the meat market in town for a while. And I always wondered why everybody in my mother's family could carve a turkey so beautifully and dress out a deer when somebody went hunting. Well, because they all worked in the meat market, that's why. But anyway, so that one just is another. I'm going through these fairly fast because a lot of these, I want you to understand the wide variety of things that can be in the newspapers. Then here we're back to Fred Lehman, who was my husband's grandfather, great-grandfather, who came to Montana in the gold rush days in the 1860s. And there's a little article about his new and splendid store. And next to it is an ad about, he's in the wholesale grocery business. And so it talks, there's an ad about his, and then he's got a new store, so it's in the paper there twice. And there are quite a few ads. Why is that? Quite a few ads for his businesses and his brother's businesses around Montana in the 1860s and 70s. This next one, why is that?
You probably can.
Doing it. Okay, here we go. Now this article, and there's 2 pages here, was a feature article in the Wenatchee Daily World of some date or the other, and I'm not sure we have the date on it. Don't think we do. I have a year somewhere. But my father-in-law was a builder of houses in Wenatchee, and he built a house in which he lived in Wenatchee for many years. And it was an interesting house because the cupboards in the kitchen on this picture that you see were all made from myrtle wood that he went to California to purchase. And the fireplace was all Arizona sandstone, which he went to Arizona and picked by hand and brought it home. All hardwood floors. It was quite a house. $27,000 it cost him to build that house in 52, I think. He built that house the year that my husband and I were married. So it was either 51 or 52. 51, I guess. Anyway. Again, and the reason that it got so much press was because one of my husband's friends at that time was still in high school in Wenatchee, but starting to write freelance newspaper articles, and he wrote this article and the paper bought it. So. All right, this next one. is, that ship is the SS Brunswick. And this is one of the more bizarre stories in my husband's family. We're talking business ventures here now. I learned a lot from this story. In 1947, my father-in-law, the war was over, the apple market was down. He'd been an apple rancher in central Washington, and he was looking around for some new business idea. People weren't building new houses right after the war and so forth. So he goes to Seattle and he purchases the SS Brunswick ship. And he and my husband's older brother and some friends spent the summer putting the thing back into shape. It had been built in 1929, so it was old and kind of run down, but they got it up and running and hired a crew. And his idea, he had a business idea that he thought would make him some money. And it could have. It didn't, but it could have. His business idea was, right after the war, people were hungry for bananas, which came from Central America. So if he loaded up the Brunswick with lumber, which he would stop at Coos Bay, Oregon and pick up, and take it to South America and sell the lumber in South America where they were looking for lumber to build houses with, and then bring home a cargo of bananas, he could make big bucks. Well, it wasn't a bad idea. However, my father-in-law was not a detailed person. So he didn't pay a whole lot of attention to whether he had all the right permits to enter the various harbors on the way. And he went El Cheapo on crew members, and he started out from Seattle in December down the Oregon coast in what was purported to be the worst winter storm in 100 years. And the ship, by the time it got to Coos Bay to pick up the lumber, was fairly damaged, and so the crew all went off and got other jobs, and they got the ship fixed, and he hired another crew who were even worse than the first bunch. And they went on down to South America, and they got down to Costa Rica, and he gives all the crew shore leave except the captain stays on board. And somehow, during the night, the ship catches fire before the lumber can be unloaded and burns. Everything burns, including the ship. So my husband's older brother, who had gone along as a summer job, had to take all of his pay that he'd gotten as a crew member and use it to pay off the rest of the crew, who were all on shore getting drunk that night and while the ship was burning. Nobody was on board but the captain. Clear up into the 1950s, this was still going on because the captain claimed that my father-in-law owed him money, and since Pops never kept any decent records, and if he had, they'd have burned with the ship anyway, he couldn't prove he didn't owe the guy money. And the captain sued him in the courts in Wenatchee, and I can remember going down to court and sitting through it for a while. In the long run, it came to nothing, but it was kind of different. Well, it wasn't different for my father-in-law, but and what I learned from this was a piece in a piece of family history, believe it or not, that I learned when I looking at that Parks family. And what I learned was this: the men in that family, and my husband had this quality too, but especially from my father-in-law on back to the time of the Revolutionary War, every generation of men in his line in the Parks family were outside the box thinkers. Some in business ways, some in inventive ways, but they all thought outside the box. Now, that can have its ups and downs. If you think outside the box and you get a good business idea like this, but you don't pay enough attention to the details because you're not a detail person, you may not make the money you think you'll make on it. But one of the earlier ones, who apparently was a little more careful, was, this was right after the Revolutionary War, very shortly after, maybe the next generation after the Revolutionary War. He was a printer of lithographs. That was his business. And he was a manufacturer of lithograph presses also in Brooklyn, New York. And he invented a new piece for a lithograph press that made it was an arm. I'll see if I can describe this, so that the press would hold the thing the print was being made from down onto the paper the print was to be put on more firmly than the old arm on the lithograph presses did, and you get a better quality lithograph print. I don't understand all of the technology, but he did invent and patent that. And several years ago, when my daughters and I went to Washington, D.C. on a research trip, my older daughter had phoned ahead, now this is a hint in case you have somebody that invents stuff, to the Smithsonian Institution, because she had done some research and she had found out that when you patented something, you had to send in a scale model of said something. So those were all at the Smithsonian Institution, and she was able to find out that at some point the Smithsonian didn't have room to keep all of those, so they tossed most of those out from earlier patent years, but they kept some samples. And one of the samples they kept was this Parks lithograph press arm. It was listed as being at the Smithsonian Institution. So my daughter calls the Smithsonian, and she runs this thing down and makes an appointment for us to go see it when we're there in Washington, D.C. And we said, how'd you know you could do that? She said, I didn't. I just kept calling around until I found out. So we showed up at the Smithsonian Institution on the right day and time, and were met in the lobby by a delighted staff member who just was thrilled that somebody wanted to see something that was in her care, because she didn't get to talk to people like that very often, and people who had actually invented one of these things. And so we went all around through the back corridors and up to the 7th floor or something like that, and she had the thing all set out on a table, and so that we could take pictures of it, and she had with it the letter that he submitted with the model, and on the letter and attached to the model with a piece of string was his handwritten note about this piece that he'd invented. And so it was a real treasure, you know, and we've got a lot of pictures of her and us with it. But so I guess the lesson to be learned here is that persistence pays off, but that's my only story. And then this part here is an article that a friend of my father-in-law's who went with them as far as Coos Bay on the journey came home and wrote a newspaper article, a story about it. And to him it was the big adventure of his life. And so that did make the newspapers. And the picture, I don't think the picture was in the newspaper. I have a copy of the picture. I have 2 big thick notebooks of records from the Brunswick's voyage that are all kinds of records, and that's a kind of a family treasure in my family. Okay, let's talk about military service. That's another thing that can get your name in the paper. Let's go on down here. That's the only one that I have on the military thing, and it's what it is just a list of men who have been drafted on that particular week, and no date on it, but it would have been 1947, because on the list is Jerry Kent Parks, who was my husband's older brother, and he graduated from high school. No, it was 1945. I'm sorry, that's my mistake. It was 1945. Jerry was 2 years older than Dick. Dick graduated in 47, and Jerry graduated in 45. Was drafted into the Army almost immediately. Went through his basic training and spent most of the war over in Montana guarding German prisoners. But he learned how to speak good German. So, but that's just, you know, another one of those categories of things you can look for sometimes in a newspaper. Now, sports and academics. This is your kids and your family and all this kind of stuff, you know, that you, every family has a lot of these kinds of things, not always in the newspaper, but maybe. Oh, come on. This is the National All-Stars baseball team from, I think, Wenatchee, probably sometime or the other. Most of the family live here. My husband's nephew's in there somewhere in that picture. You know, this is the usual kind of thing. The next one is Eastern Washington University ski team in the around 1949 or 50, and that's my husband and that's my cousin. They were best buddies. Just the kind of things you keep. No citations. Now, here's one. This is Columbia University in New York City in 1880. And this is a list of the persons who graduated from that university in that year. And right here under with the yellow on it is a guy by the name of Gouverneur Ogden, who was a cousin of the Parks family. And somewhere on the back, which I think isn't here for some reason, is John R. Parks, who was my husband's grandfather, and he became a very well-known mining engineer and did mining surveys for most of the western railroads in the United States, and invented what's called the Parks electrocyanide process for extracting precious metals from the ore, and patented it in Los Angeles, California. That made the newspapers, but we don't have any of the clippings. When the plant blew up, it was destroyed, and everybody in the family had invested all their money in it. It was all lost. So what can I say? You know, this one is just one of these school things where this is a bunch of kids in school that graduated from all the way through high school with grade point averages of 3.87 or better. And my husband's nephew is this kid right here. Became a psychologist, died from a heart attack at age 50. But you know, we have several things like that we kept. Letters to the editor. This is one of my favorites. This letter, now let me find it so I can read it to you. This letter is one that opened numerous doors for me in genealogy. And it says, to the Chronicle, this was the newspaper in Omak, Washington, on July 29, 1966. I am interested in genealogy and for several years have been trying to contact descendants of Hiram and Ella Carroll Stalder. Those were my grandparents. They had a bunch of daughters who married men of the name of Tilden, Bailey, Raymer, Darnell, Dennis, and Todd, and one son, Jake Wesley Stalder. Hiram Stalder was my great uncle, brother to my wonderful grandmother, Hattie Bell Stalder Dooley. Is it possible to print my query in your paper? Some members of this family are known to have lived in your area at one time. Thank you, Bernice Miller Vaughn from Lodi, California. Okay, it was printed in the Omak, Washington newspaper in August of 1986. Although it's dated 66, so it probably was really 66. The son of one of my cousin's second wife, who lived in Omak, saw the letter, recognized the name Yarnell, which was my cousin's name, and sent him a copy of the letter from the newspaper. And my cousin carried it in his pocket for several years, in his wallet, forgot all about it. Sometime after my husband and I moved over to Eastern Washington in 1990, Clarence gave me the clipping. And I wrote to Bernice and discovered that she was the daughter of Aunt Hattie's daughter, Elsa Miller, with whom I had corresponded in the 1960s. She was also the older sister of Billy Miller, who had visited our house in Spokane when he was an 18-year-old sailor stationed at Farragut near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho during World War II. Several years later, we visited Bernice in Lodi. At that time, she loaned us 2 notebooks of Stalder information, which we took to a Lodi print place and copied much of. I have corresponded with her off and on for at least 10 or 12 years. She passed away in 2004 of a heart attack. But meanwhile, she had written Okay, and then there's a little bio about her with her. This is not really an obituary, but Bernice Miller Vaughn graduated from Park College in Missouri in 1934 and received a master's degree in educational administration from the University of Pacific in Stockton, California in 1960. She was a teacher and school administrator for 35 years. She retired in 1978. She has had articles in Reminisce, Good Old Days, and other magazines. And I have copies of 5 articles she wrote for Heritage Quest magazine when it was in print. So this one was a gem, as it turned out. It's a wonder I ever saw it, but it was a letter to the editor, so don't not read that. You never know. Then this next stuff is, this one. My mother-in-law was a huge baseball fan. And this is just a letter where she's giving them her opinion about what's going on with the local Wenatchee Chiefs baseball team. And the team one year voted her their #1 fan, and she had free tickets to all the games. She loved her baseball. That's just, again, a sample of a letter. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. Now this one, okay. This is from Run 1. Let's see if I've got a copy of this one that I can actually read it to you, because this created a feud. It started a lawsuit. This letter is from a man named Frank F.C. Barber in Wenatchee, Washington, dated March 24, 1940. And he's talking about a letter that my father had written to the editor of the Wenatchee Daily World. And he's replying to those letters, and he says that, they're both mad at the paper for printing the letters. But, and then he says something about the dire financial situation prevailing in north central Washington and people struggling to make a living and so forth. And this had to do with whether you were for the business world and the economic stuff that was supposed to come out of that. Mr. Barber was into mining, and my dad, who was an environmentalist and wanted to preserve national parks and that sort of thing. And so they were on two sides of that issue. And they started in with this correspondence, which just got more and more virulent between the two until they were calling each other names in print, and the newspaper was eating it up, of course. This went on from March of 1940 into, I don't know, I guess mostly 1940. But the newspaper gave it a lot of coverage. Finally, my father got so mad he was going to sue the newspaper, or sue Mr. Barber or something. Well, the reason those got kept is because lo, these many years later, I wish Larry Dean were here, lo, these many years later, my husband's sister married Frank Barber's son. They lived here in Vancouver for many years. And Jim Barber, Mr. Frank Barber's son, worked with Larry Dean at, wherever Larry Dean worked here. But anyway, Larry knew him quite well. But, and he would get a kick out of these. I'll have to show them to him sometime. But this whole, coincidence down the road a piece. And Jim Barber would never have written letters like his dad did, nor like my dad did, for that matter. They both had a temper, and they got mad at each other in the newspaper again. Scandal makes a good story. So, and I'm just about done with the slides here, and we're going to end with some just, don't forget specialized newspapers. And let's see. Okay, I just have 2 items from newspapers. Specialized newspapers can be anything from a church newspaper to a newspaper put out by an ethnic group, or people who speak a particular language, or people in a particular occupation, or who have a particular hobby or interest. there's just all kinds of, there are financial newspapers. One of the big, well, there's a couple of large religious organizations that we've gotten a lot of genealogical material from, not necessarily from their newspapers, but they do print newspapers. One is the Presbyterian Historical Society, which has a big headquarters and library in Philadelphia. They put out a newsletter, but they also have done newspapers in the past and maybe still do. And the other is the Moravian Archives, which are also in Philadelphia, and there again, they've printed newspapers. If you have any people back a ways that were members of any of those churches, or any churches, there are lots of Catholic newspapers. There are many, many ethnic and foreign language newspapers, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s when a lot of people were coming over from Europe. Don't neglect looking at some of those, because sometimes those they'll have a lot of articles, because what all these papers representing those groups, especially those ones from people from other countries and other languages, would have helping societies that helped people come to this country as immigrants and help them find a place to live and find a job and learn the ropes and learn the language and all that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of names and a lot of interesting information in those kinds of papers. And the religious ones were somewhat similar, but these are from a couple of flying newspapers. And I just have two samples that are kind of interesting. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but this one, Duckus Colitis, is from the Pacific Flyer, December 1989. And the editor's note says, the following accident report, dated May 5, 1941, was sent by Major Harry V. Hubbard, the pilot, to his hospital roommate, Captain Edward L. Dennis, that's my dad, describing the aircraft accidents which led to his hospitalization. His hospitalization at Barnes General Hospital here in Vancouver, which was here during World War II and for a while afterwards. My father was a patient there because they had discovered, which he already knew, that he had leukemia, and he was discharged from the service shortly after. Got home just the day before Pearl Harbor, and he was not a happy camper. Anyway, but this guy was apparently his roommate in the hospital, and my dad spent 4 months at Barnes and hated every minute of it because we were not allowed to visit him, and he was not allowed to come home to Spokane to visit us during that 4 months. So to him it was just like being in prison. So he and his roommate, which I think was this probably Harry Hubbard, every once in a while they managed to sneak out of the hospital and take the bus and go over to Portland to the movies. But anyway, but this one is a humorous thing, and it just starts out where the guy is writing this funny accident report. They didn't have a whole bunch to do for amusement, so they created their own. And so he talks about, and he says, description of trouble. While cruising at 6,500 feet on a routine night flying mission in a B-23 airplane, AC number 39-62, the following described difficulty was encountered. Immediately after passing over the Spokane radio station Cone of Silence and entering the westerly A quadrant, said airplane had a direct head-on collision with a 1-pound, 12-ounce specimen of Avis aquavinus quacus, more generally known as a bluebill duck. As far as could be determined, said duck was flying east directly on the beam and without passing lights or running lights of any kind, thus giving the pilot no opportunity to duck the duck. The immediate result of the accident was the appearance of a hole in the starboard windshield, approximately 6 inches wide and directly over the pilot's head, following which the wind blew and the duck flew into the cabin. After a short delay in which the pilot was separated from the duck and the ship's engineer was tied in his seat, a deferred landing was made at the Spokane airport. Upon examination after landing, the duck was found to be dead, subject demise being patently due to suffocation caused by its head being driven through its tail empennage, so on and so forth. So it's just one of those nutty things that people save, you know. The other one is also from an aircraft newspaper. And this one is called Lesson Learns, and this one's from the Western Flyer on December 1968. And it was written by my husband because he was writing about a friend of his and his wife who had flown to California in a small plane. This guy was not a real experienced pilot. He'd been flying for 5 or 6 years maybe. And they were coming back from California, and they were coming up by Mount Shasta, near Mount Shasta, and headed for Medford, Oregon. And you go through a little pass in there over some mountains along the Oregon-California border. And they went up a wrong canyon, and the weather shut down, and they crashed the plane, and they were both killed, and their bodies were not found for a couple of years. And Dick is talking about what happened, and he's talking about he and another friend who, as soon as they learned of this, they got in their planes and they went down to Medford, where all the local pilots were flying over the countryside to see if they could find the plane wreck. Well, it's heavily wooded country and canyons and hills. They didn't find them. They flew for, it was Civil Air Patrol and the Josephine County Sheriff's Office. They had all these P-16 search sorties were flown in one day, and so on and so forth. And they picked up one signal north of Grants Pass, and so they gridded an area 10 miles on either side of I-5 from Medford to Cottage Grove. Pilots were assigned grids. Ground search groups were deployed. Coordination with the sheriff's office was established. And by Wednesday evening, 24 sorties had been flown. They didn't find them. Some loggers found them 4 or 5 years later, found their remains. But he's just talking about, let's see. Oh, if you don't, and what Dick is saying is, lesson learned is, if you don't use a flight plan, leave detailed flight information with family or friends. If trouble does come, the Civil Air Patrol and its wonderful people will do their best to help. So he's just saying, here's how you're supposed to do when you're flying a small plane. We never had anything happen to us in our small plane, although we did make one emergency landing at the Olympia Airport once. But that's it. The engine quit, but we were right over the Olympia Airport. So that's that on the slides. But I do want to talk a little bit more about, and what I'm trying to show you with that was simply the huge variety of newspaper stuff that's out there, and way beyond just obituaries or vital statistics records. Don't neglect looking for that, and especially in older newspapers. Your handouts have some interesting stuff in them that's quite new. And I want to talk about the handouts a little bit because, and this, I didn't copy the latest issue of Family Tree magazine, which should be in there in our library, it's the December 2016 issue, has inside it, this magazine has in each issue a little workbook of several pages worth on a topic. This one's on newspapers this month. And it's very good. It's by Lisa Louise Cook. Some of you have probably seen some webinars by her on the webinars. And it's a very good overall article. When I read it, I thought, heck, I could have just made copies of this and skipped doing the lecture, but I couldn't really do that because you would be bordering on violating copyright to do that. But if any of you want to make a copy for your personal use, it's in there on the magazine shelf. You can do that. Then, there are some other things that I wanted to just call to your attention. Let's see, where are we going here with this? You do have in your handouts, if I can find my copy of it, of them. You want to take a quick break while I get my handouts out? No, I'll do that. I want to take a 5-minute break. If anybody wants to. Just a couple of days ago, I got a little newsletter thingy that I get every week from the Washington State Library. I used to work for them for 25 years. And so I'm still on their mailing list, and probably always will be. But there's usually a lot of good stuff on there. And what I got this time had to do with something called the Newspaper Project, the National Newspaper Project, which was started probably around 30 years ago or so. And it was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was quite a bit of federal money available from that source. And they partnered with state libraries around the country in this newspaper project. And every state in the Union, I believe, participated in one way or another. I was just telling some of these people over here, and it was mostly state libraries or state archives that partnered with the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress administered the money from the Endowment for the Humanities. So the state archives or state libraries, for the most part, who worked with the Library of Congress to develop the programs in their state. And part of that, or that project, was designed to bring all the newspapers that existed or had existed in each state into one central place and microfilm them. That was the original project. And it happened differently in different places because, as I was just explaining to someone, every state in the Union has a state library agency, and every state in the Union has a state archives agency. That's where the similarity ends. What they call them, whether they're combined together or with some other agency or standalone agencies, is different in every state. How they're structured within state government is different in every state. So Washington has one of the better ones in both our state archives and state libraries. And part of my reason for saying that is that when the state of Illinois decided to start a library program for their state institutions, who did they come to find a model? Washington State. You know, that was the big guy coming to the little guys to find out how to do it right. So we have an excellent state library. We have had for many long years. We have an excellent state archives. We have had for many years. They are separate agencies, but in Washington, they're both under the Secretary of State, whose third arm is to take care of elections. Seems an odd combination, and that's fairly new. That happened about 20 years ago, maybe, something like that. But at any rate, the state library agencies and the National Endowment for the Humanities, which had a lot of federal money in the late 60s and through the 70s, partnered with the Library of Congress, who administered it, in this thing called the Newspaper Project. And every state then gathered those newspapers, little ones and big ones, as many as they could find anywhere. They contacted all the small libraries around their states, all the genealogical and historical societies. Everybody was scrambling to find issues of old newspapers, and everything that they could find then was microfilmed. And a lot of that microfilm, and the state library in Washington has most of that microfilm, although there may be some at the state archives too. Most of the places would loan those rolls of microfilm on interlibrary loan. And there are still newspapers that have not been digitized but are available on microfilm, maybe from state library agencies. Fairly recently, that whole newspaper project at the national level has morphed into something run by the Library of Congress called Chronicling America, with their databases of newspapers, free newspapers. You've probably all heard of that. And this is one of your handouts. And the print, I'm sorry to say, is ridiculously small, but it's about that project. and how it's morphed into what it is today and how to access it. So you get out your magnifying glass and read it. It's an excellent handout. But and what it amounts to is this: Chronicling America is a free database, a lot of stuff online, but not everything is online. There's still more that's microfilmed. Not everything is at the Library of Congress. There are smaller newspapers elsewhere in the country, probably on microfilm. Different states are digitizing stuff. One of your handouts talks about the state of Washington and its recent digitizing efforts to digitize more newspapers. As the money is available, and money's much tighter now than it used to be. But read these, and they will tell you how to access newspapers all over the place. And the article that I talked about that's in the little workbook in the Family Tree magazine has, as does this, I think, somewhere, a bibliography of other newspaper sites, both, this one maybe doesn't, both, no, this one doesn't, both for pay and free. So I urge you to take a look at this Family Tree Workbook article and make your own copy if you want to. I did not copy it, the little workbook, because that would be possibly bordering on copyright infringement. It's a little iffy whether you can have exceptions to some of the copyright rules for educational purposes. So it might have been okay under that, but educational purposes is defined as students with a teacher in a classroom. Now, maybe that's what you guys are today for a couple hours. Maybe somebody could argue with that being the right definition. I know that you can download and print one for your personal use, one copy for your personal use. Don't share it with your family, or tell anybody about it if you do. You probably will, but don't tell anybody, because I was just reading some stuff by Judy Russell, who's one of the foremost copyright experts around, and she says there are no family exceptions for violation of copyright, period. So you can't copy stuff that you find somewhere about your family and send it off to 20 relatives without probably violating copyright. You can tell them where to download their own copy. So, okay, but anyway, this handout is hard to read because the print is so tiny, but it is well worth reading. And then you should have one. Do you have one about the state of Washington stuff? Thought I took it. Yeah. That's within the last week that came through. Yeah. And so they are doing more digitizing and wanting to continue to do more. With the change in the political climate in this country, it's anybody's guess how well these public agencies will continue to be funded in the future. Schools and libraries are often some of the very first things people cut when they're cutting funding. Don't ask me why, because one of the last things they should be cutting, but it's not, it doesn't always work that way. So, yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, and this does have quite a few digitized newspapers listed, and I know that both the state archives and the state library here want to digitize more, and that is the wave of the future, is going to be the digitized stuff. And we were talking about our little preservation grant yesterday. Brian and I were meeting with Brad Richardson from the Historical Society and Rob Schimmelfennig, who's Clark County's best expert on archival stuff, works for WSU, Vancouver primarily, but does cooperative projects with other people on a little preservation grant that the Genealogical Society has put in to preserve those early tax record ledgers that we were given last year. And where was I going with lost my point, sorry, it'll come back to me.
You
But,
met with them.
but, no, we met with Robin, oh, thank you, he was telling us, he said that free access to everything is the way to the future. That everybody's doing all this digitizing of newspapers, books, making them searchable often when they can, not always, sometimes you have to browse. But the current thinking is make all this stuff freely accessible to anybody and everybody. Don't charge them for using it, don't restrict them from using it, make it free for everybody. Now, there's a lot of administrative problems involved with that sometimes, some big, some not so big, but for us who are the consumers of information, it's a good idea. So you know, I'm just not sure what the future is going to bring, but it's going to take money to do it. And with the changes in our political climate, who knows how much money is going to flow to places like universities and state libraries for those kinds of projects, when you're then going to offer free access to them to the general public. I don't know. Anybody's guess at this moment. But there's a lot of stuff on microfilm that you can get, and many places will want it. I wasn't able to borrow that Arkansas Gazette from 1836, but that was then, and I don't know what it would be now, and I don't know how widespread that was even then. You can but try. So one of the things to do, and some libraries have subscriptions to some of the pay newspaper sites, some do not, many do not, but you can but try. So one of the things to do, if you're looking for a newspaper, especially small newspapers from small communities and back in history a ways, is to make contact through a phone call or an email or a website with a local library or a local historical society or a local genealogical society or state level ones, maybe all of the above, and ask them what they've got in the way of newspapers and how available they are. What have they got in microfilm? What was the local newspaper? And is it microfilm? Is it digitized? How available is it to people? Is there a charge to borrow the microfilm? So on and so forth. I've gotten a lot of good information from Des Moines County, Iowa, where I had several families back before the Civil War, early 1800s, from their newspaper. Often they've been quoted in their Genealogical Society articles. And for one example, I'll give you, it was out of their newspaper, their local newspaper in 1845, which had a little article about all the young men leaving next week from Des Moines County, Iowa to go to California to the California Gold Rush. It included my great-great-grandmother's two brothers. Their names were on the list. And that's where they did go, and we were able to find them there. But that, you know, documented that really that they did go on that trip to California. So you can find all kinds of things like that in small newspapers, in small communities. In Washington State, there's something called the Rural Heritage Network, and that's kind of a combination of websites from smaller communities. I know Stevens County, north of Spokane, where I used to live, and Elsie, you'll be familiar maybe with that area as well. They're very big in the Rural Heritage Organization. And there's a website. I think if you just did a Google search for Rural Heritage Network, you'd get that site. And there's a lot of stuff available through them that comes from small libraries and museums in rural communities in Washington State, small rural places. So all of those are ways to find newspaper stuff. If all else fails, Google searches are good. You'd be surprised what you can find with a Google search. You could put in Well, probably a location, a place is a good way to start, and then combined with something with newspapers. You could do it by name too, but you might have better, at least if you start with a place, you're likely to find out what local newspapers exist. GenWeb is another place where often you can find what local records exist in the local courthouse, what the hours for the courthouse are, what's available in the way of local libraries, genealogical societies, historical societies, and how to contact them, that kind of thing. Use those resources to run down local newspapers, and once you've run down where the newspaper is, then then you can check to see if it's been microfilmed, and if that microfilm is available on interlibrary loan, or if it's been digitized as part of a digitization project. That essentially is newspaper strategy. That's how you do it. But again, this article in here is very good, very good. And I'll just close with one that I wanted to use as an example, and I couldn't find it. It was an obituary. I've told people about this before. It was an obituary for my great-grandfather's twin brother in Missouri. And he died, I don't know, around the turn of the century somewhere. He's buried in the little town of Farbler in Audrain County in Missouri. And he was married 3 times. In his obituary, it mentions the names of his wives. And wife number 2 was Harriet Whitson. That's the only place we've ever found her name in print. She was a sister to the wife Martha Whitson of John's twin brother Thomas, who was my great-grandfather. She died in childbirth, and the family story that I've known for years was that when Harriet died in childbirth, Martha weaned her year-old baby and took on nursing this newborn infant to try to keep him alive. And indeed, in the 1850 census, first one that has names, the father, John, and his baby, whose name I've forgotten, was living in the household with Martha and Thomas and their children in Tennessee. So, but the only document that ever mentions Harriet and identifies her with John Carroll, her husband, is that obituary for John. Nothing else. Never found any other record for her, nor for the child who died when he was 4 or 5 years old. The little boy didn't live. But it did document the truth of the family story, and it identified what previous to that Harriet had been nothing more than a hash mark on the 1840 census in an age category that I knew included my great-grandmother, because I knew from family records the year she was born. But on that same little narrow range of 12 to 16 or something like that, on the 1840 census, there are 3 hash marks. And okay, I knew great-grandma. The obituary provided Harriet as number 2. Whether she was older or younger than my great-grandmother, I'm not sure. And there's a third one, which I have a name for from their mother's will. And her name was Eliza Jane Bell, and I think Bell was a married name. I have never been able to find Eliza Jane Bell anywhere. I have gone through the entire Tennessee census. I've gone through the entire Missouri census for 1850 to see if she's somewhere. Can't find her. I don't know. Gone through everybody named Bell. I've gone through everybody named Whitson. I've gone through everybody named Witherspoon, which was her mother's maiden name. Can't find her. So, anyway, any questions? Yeah.
Make a comment. There are places where the newspaper is only exists in its original form at the newspaper office too. I ran into that with the Statesman Examiner.
Did you really? That's interesting. I know they've kept a lot of theirs. Most places have given that up, but I'm glad to know that,
This is 20 years ago.
well, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised by what it's the same. I know I haven't tried that lately. But yes, and that is another place to try. If all else fails, go to the newspaper office. And if they don't have them, they'll tell you where they are. So, a lot of them have given up keeping the old original ones these days because they don't want to be bothered with people coming in and asking them all the time for copies. But, but that's a good point though, Elsie. There still probably are small places, especially around the country, that still have those original newspapers. Yeah. Another tip in some of the articles is to look in the Ancestry Red Book under a county or a state, because there will be usually a section on newspapers in the Red Book write-up on a state that tells you where the major newspaper repositories are, and that's a good tip. That's a good tip. That Ancestry Red Book is all online now on the Ancestry website. It's all been digitized, so you can go and download it for any county or any state in the country off the Ancestry website. I can't tell you exactly where on that website. I figured it out once, but go on Ancestry and try. Because it is online, and you can find that kind of information. I used to find those sections in Ancestry Red Book, and they still are. Going back to Bee's topic of her class, if you're going on a research trip to read what it says in the Ancestry Red Book and elsewhere about where's the county courthouse located in place you want to visit? Is there a genealogical society? Is there a historical society? Where are they located? What records do they have? And so on and so forth and so forth. So you do some research on the place before you get there if you're making a trip. But you can also often find out how to contact them to find out what they have and whether they'll interlibrary loan that microfilm of the newspaper or whatever. So don't neglect that as a piece of your toolbox for newspaper research or any other kind for that matter. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.